The fires rise in silence. The crowd stands still. A queen, draped in crimson silk, walks toward the pyre where her husband's body lies lifeless. There is no tear in her eye, not because she feels no pain, but because centuries of tradition have taught her that sorrow itself is forbidden. The drums beat slower now, and as the flames grow higher, she folds her hands, steps forward, and vanishes into fire. They called it Sati, a ritual that transformed widows into offerings, turning royal wives into symbols of purity, loyalty, and sacrifice. But beneath that veil of devotion lay something far more sinister: power, politics, and fear disguised as faith. In ancient and medieval India, when a king died, his widow was often forced, sometimes deceived, to burn alive on his funeral pyre. The act was said to purify both souls and ensure they met again in the afterlife. But for many it was nothing short of murder, sanctioned by custom, glorified by myth. The practice found its roots in the early Hindu texts but took its darkest form during the Rajput and Mughal eras. In royal courts, Sati became both spectacle and statement, a way for kingdoms to display loyalty, pride, and defiance. A widow's flames were seen as proof that a dynasty was unbroken, that even death could not conquer its honor. But imagine the horror of those queens, forced to adorn themselves like brides, paraded through the city, their faces hidden behind jewels and flowers. The priest chanted. The crowd wept. The pyre was lit. And as the fire consumed everything, so too did it consume the truth, the screams, the fear, and the forced obedience that history would later bury under the word devotion. Not all queens went willingly. Some were drugged, some trapped within the pyre, others pushed when the flames grew too strong. Yet the world called them goddesses, martyrs of virtue. And those who resisted, they were labeled impure, cursed, forgotten. One of the most haunting tales is that of Rani Padmavati, whose story, though wrapped in legend, symbolizes this grim tradition. When Alauddin Khilji laid siege to Chittorgarh, Padmavati and thousands of Rajput women performed jauhar, mass self-immolation, rather than fall into enemy hands. What history calls bravery was, in truth, an act born from despair, queens and concubines burning to escape a fate worse than death. Centuries later, when the British colonized India, they witnessed this ritual and used it to paint Indian culture as barbaric. Yet many of them watched the burnings with morbid fascination, documenting every scream, every spark. It was only in 1829, under the rule of Lord William Bentinck and with the efforts of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, that Sati was officially banned. But by then, thousands of royal women had already vanished into the flames of loyalty. What the world saw as divine sacrifice was, in truth, a kingdom's way of silencing its queens forever. And that's the story of the burning thrones of India, where devotion became destruction, and power turned purity into ash. They said the flames purified, but what if they only hid the sins of kings? After the first sparks of Sati had dimmed, its shadow continued to stretch across centuries, not because of faith but because of fear. In royal palaces, the ritual became a tool, a way to protect legacies, erase scandals, and silence inconvenient queens. The moment a king died, his court trembled, not out of grief but out of paranoia. A living widow could still speak. She could claim the throne, expose secrets, or threaten alliances. A dead one could not. For many kingdoms, Sati was not devotion, it was control. It was politics disguised as piety. Behind the palace walls, whispers echoed, "The queen must follow her husband." The priests justified it, the courtiers enforced it, and the people glorified it. The queen's fire became a kingdom's armor. The smoke rising from the pyre wasn't just her soul ascending, it was the erasure of her voice, her history, her truth. In the Rajput courts of Rajasthan, the tradition was upheld as divine duty. A queen's refusal to commit sati could tarnish her family's honor forever. Stories tell of royal widows drugged with opium, their trembling hands tied, their cries drowned beneath the chants of "Hail the Goddess." The next morning, her ashes were gathered like relics, and her name was sung in temples, not remembered in pain but celebrated as purity. But not all bowed before the flames. Some fought. Some ran. Some cursed the kings and priests who pushed them toward fire. Their names were erased, their portraits never painted. Yet their silence still lingers, like embers that never truly died. Even after the ban in 1829, whispers of Sati refused to fade. In some royal families, it continued in secret, hidden from the British eyes. Because for them it was not about religion anymore, it was about pride. A Rajput queen who lived after her husband's death was seen as an omen of weakness. And so, under the dark sky of tradition, the fires burned again. They called it loyalty. But loyalty forced is slavery. The men who lit the pyres spoke of eternal love, yet their love demanded blood and silence. The priests spoke of moksha, liberation, but what liberation comes from being denied life itself? As centuries passed, the Sati fires became legend, turned into paintings, songs, and folklore that glorified the act. But no song tells of the queens who screamed for mercy. No painting shows the guards who held them down. And no chronicle speaks of the men who watched, not out of grief but to ensure no one escaped. This was not holiness. It was horror wrapped in hymns. And the kingdoms that built their pride upon these flames now stand as ruins, their stories burned with the queens they silenced. Because the truth is, those fires didn't die. They only changed shape, from funeral pyres to memories, from tradition to trauma. They say history remembers the brave. But in India's royal courts, it remembered only the burned. The story of Sati was never just about women, it was about men who wanted to be gods. Kings believed their deaths deserved more than mourning, they demanded spectacle. A fire that would turn grief into worship, shame into glory. And so, as their bodies turned to ash, their queens were thrown into the same blaze, unwilling sacrifices to feed the myth of divine kingship. But behind every flame was a whisper, a question that the priests never answered. If loyalty is pure, why must it burn to prove itself? In the 17th century, when the Mughal Empire looked upon Rajput lands, even emperors like Akbar were horrified. He banned Sati in his territories, calling it a cruelty masked as virtue. Yet in many royal states the ritual continued, not out of love for the gods but out of fear of dishonor. One tale still haunts the sands of Rajasthan, the story of Rani Roop Kanwar centuries later in 1987. Yes, 1987. The world had televisions, satellites, and nuclear weapons. Yet in a small village in Diarala, a young widow was pushed into her husband's pyre while hundreds watched. They cheered, not screamed. They hailed her as a goddess. And when the smoke rose, it wasn't just her body that vanished, it was the illusion that the past had ever died. Even in the modern world, the ghost of Sati lingered. In those moments, time itself felt broken, as if the flames of ancient palaces had reached across centuries to touch the present. But history, cruel as it is, always hides its rebels. There were queens who refused. There were wives who fought. There were women who escaped in the night, disguising themselves as servants or soldiers, vanishing into forests, living nameless lives. Their only sin was wanting to breathe. And there was one, Rani Ahilya by Holkar, who defied the ritual, who chose to rule instead of burn. She transformed her kingdom into a beacon of justice and compassion. While others turned to ash, she turned her grief into strength. Her defiance became a wound in the tradition, small but deep. And slowly, other voices began to rise, like sparks refusing to die out. By the time the British outlawed Sati in 1829 under Lord William Bentinck, the land itself seemed to sigh. But a ban cannot erase belief, and belief cannot erase guilt. For centuries, kings built their thrones on the ashes of queens. And today their palaces stand silent, haunted not by ghosts, but by memories of women whose names were never written, whose screams were never heard, whose loyalty was stolen and rebranded as love. They called them goddesses, but they were prisoners, prisoners of honor, of pride, of fire. And so the story ends not in devotion, but in defiance. Because the greatest queen is not the one who burns for her king, but the one who survives him.